In the heart of Australia, in the middle of arid desert, stretching thousands of kilometers, there exists a farm called Anna Creek Station. If you just look at the staff structure, you will think this is a small farm because this place only has 11 employees, including one manager, 8 people working directly on the farm, 1 person in charge of facilities, and 1 chef in charge of food. But the truth makes the whole world surprised. The area of this farm is larger than the entire territory of Israel. Specifically, Anna Creek Station is 23,677 kilometers wide, while the area of Israel is only about 22,000 kilometers square. In other words, a cattle farm in Australia can swallow a country with a population of nearly 10 million people. This raises a big question. How can they maintain operations on such a large land with only 11 people? The answer lies in the nature of Australian-style farming, which requires no farming, no greenhouses, and no sophisticated irrigation systems. Instead, herds of cattle such as beef cattle roam freely on the wildlands, living almost instinctively with only water and hay. Managers simply monitor the herd via airplane drone or GPS to check on the location and health of the cattle. This allows for efficient operations without requiring too much labor. Anna Creek Station was originally established in 1863, more than 160 years ago, and has changed hands several times. It is currently owned by S. Kidman & Co., one of Australia's largest cattle ranching groups. The area is located in the so-called Outback, the most remote, wild, arid, and sparsely populated inland region of Australia. There, the population density is close to zero, and living conditions are so harsh that they are almost unimaginable to city dwellers. Anna Creek is also a symbol of the typical large-scale agricultural model of Australia, where large areas do not mean large numbers of people. On the contrary, the further inland you go, the more you see the contrast: vast, land-sparse population, wild nature, and people almost disappear from the map. Not only Anna Creek, hundreds of other similar farms exist in the central and northern regions of Australia, but Anna Creek is the most typical example to illustrate the reality. Australia is a country with the highest rate of vacant land in the world. And that does not come from laziness or abandonment, but is a consequence of geography, climate, and typical production models throughout the history of this continent. The existence of giant farms like Anna Creek also suggests another perspective on humanity. While many parts of the world are struggling with a lack of living space, in one part of the planet, people still choose to live hundreds of kilometers apart, leaving most of the land to nature. This is not just a living choice, but a forced adaptation to a harsh environment, where only those who truly understand the land, water, and weather can survive. If you think farms like Anna Creek are just an Australian oddity, remember that they are an everyday reality and a reminder that humans cannot impose urban or industrial development on any land, especially dry desert and dangerous places like the center of Australia. Why is 95% of Australia nearly empty? Australia is a huge country covering nearly 7.7 million square kilometers, equivalent to the 48 continental states of the United States combined. However, what has surprised the world is this: less than 0.3% of its land area, or about 0.22%, is actually home to 90% of Australia's population. In other words, more than 95% of the remaining territory is virtually uninhabited. This is not a waste of resources, but an inevitable consequence of the harsh natural conditions and unique survival limits that this continent possesses. The biggest reason why Australia's interior is so uninhabited is because of its extremely dry climate. Much of the continent lies within the subtropical high-pressure zone, where air is constantly compressed, reducing the ability to form rain. In addition, this region is affected by a cold ocean current from Antarctica, called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which causes low ocean temperatures and does not create enough conditions for water vapor to evaporate and condense into rain clouds. That is why Australia rarely has rain clouds, especially in inland areas. The heat is not enough to lift the water vapor-laden air high, the condensation process is limited, and as a result, rainfall in most of Australia is extremely low, many places less than 250 more year. That is reaching desert standards. In addition to climate factors, terrain is also a major barrier to rain formation. While other continents have many high mountain ranges that help create orographic rainfall or geographic rainfall, Australia is too flat. Only about 6% of Australia's area is above 600 meters in elevation. Australia's highest mountain, Mount Kosciuszko, is only 2,228 meters high, much lower than the mountains of Asia, Europe, or the Americas. The lack of steep terrain means moisture cannot be forced uphill and condensed into rain, a crucial condition for sustaining natural life and agriculture. In addition, the El Niño phenomenon often weakens the monsoons, reducing rainfall across the continent. As a result, more than 70% of Australia is semi-desert or true desert, creating the so-called Outback, a vast, desolate, arid, and extremely dangerous land with harsh living conditions, high temperatures, low humidity, poor sandy soil, and many poisonous creatures such as desert snakes, venomous spiders, scorpions, etc. It is therefore no surprise that major cities such as Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide, located on the east and southeast coasts, have become the main centers of population. About 85% of Australians live within 50 kilometers of the coast, where the climate is milder, water is reliable and economic, and transport infrastructure is easily accessible. In short, the reason why 95% of Australia is virtually empty is not because of a lack of exploitation, but because nature has set up harsh barriers to life. The flat terrain, semi-arid climate, chronic drought, and isolation from rain all create an ecosystem that is difficult for humans to inhabit, let alone urban development or large-scale agriculture. Only by understanding these barriers can we see the full picture of Australia's population, a country with one of the largest land areas in the world, but with an incredibly low population density. Not because of a lack of land, but because that land cannot support its people. When it comes to the reasons why most of Australia is uninhabited, many people immediately think of historical factors or immigration policies. But the underlying cause lies in harsh natural conditions, a fact that cannot be changed by will or technology. More than 70% of Australia is semi-desert or true desert, and the natural conditions here are almost impossible for human life to sustain in the long term. Firstly, Australia is the driest continent in the world excluding Antarctica. Inland summer temperatures can exceed 45 degrees Celsius, while average annual rainfall is only 150 tons to 250 millimeters, equivalent to desert climate standards as defined by the World Meteorological Organization (WMO). Unlike the Middle East, where large rivers cross deserts, Australia's arid regions do not have abundant groundwater resources, nor do they have large rivers that flow regularly. Rainwater systems are virtually non-existent year-round, making basic activities such as growing crops, raising livestock, and maintaining permanent populations impossible. Second, the soils in inland Australia are predominantly sandy and saline, which are extremely poor in nutrients and do not retain moisture. This makes any agricultural effort costly and inefficient. To sustain a hectare of land in such an environment, people must use drip irrigation, chemical fertilizers, and groundwater. But groundwater reserves here are also unstable, easily depleted, and overexploitation can cause subsidence or soil salinization. This is not only an economic disadvantage, but also a serious environmental risk. Third, the ecosystems in uninhabited areas of Australia also pose a high risk to human health. Native species such as the inland taipan, considered the world's most venomous snake funnel web spiders, desert scorpions, giant centipedes, etc., are all common in desert and semi-desert areas. In addition, large-scale bushfires, such as the 2020 disaster that burned tens of millions of hectares of forest, make these lands even more dangerous, unstable, and uninhabitable in the long term. Fourth, climate change is making already harsh regions even more extreme. According to a report by the Australian Climate Council, the number of days with temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius in inland Australia has doubled in just 50 years, while the frequency and intensity of droughts are becoming more severe. Places that could once be used as rest stops or mining sites are now becoming unviable in the long term. This is a problem that cannot be solved by infrastructure or financial investment alone, because nature cannot be improved when the ecological foundation has exceeded its carrying capacity. Finally, there is a less mentioned but extremely important factor: spatial isolation. Australia's uninhabited regions are not only arid, but also hundreds, even thousands, of kilometers away from transport, electricity, telecommunications, health and security systems. Building infrastructure to connect these areas to the rest of the country would cost tens of billions of dollars without necessarily yielding a commensurate return. The Australian government and private enterprises are well aware of this reality and have chosen a more reasonable option, focusing on coastal development where natural conditions are favorable and the risks are much lower. One of the most important factors that shape the population density of any country is water, and in Australia, this is more evident than ever. Despite being the sixth largest country in the world, Australia has no major year-round rivers, nor do it have abundant natural freshwater systems like the Nile, Amazon, or Yangtze. In this context, the Murray-Darling River system has become a rare blood vessel of life, the only thing that can sustain urban agricultural and human life on a small part of this arid continent. The Murray-Darling system consists of two main rivers: the Murray River, about 2,508 km long, and the Darling River, about 1,572 km long. Together, they form a network of waterways that flows through southeastern Australia, particularly through the states of New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia. Although not as powerful as other rivers on other continents, the Murray-Darling is still the main source of water for more than 3 million people and accounts for 40% of the country's agricultural output. However, it is worth noting that this river system is very weak in flow and unstable seasonally. The annual flow rate fluctuates greatly, depending largely on the snowmelt from the Snowy Mountains, part of the Great Dividing Range. When the snow melts in spring, water flows into the Murray-Darling, creating conditions for irrigation and domestic use. But in summer and years of prolonged El Niño, the water flow drops sharply, causing many areas to fall into severe drought. Some sections of the river even dried up completely in years such as 2002 and 2019, causing great damage to agriculture and people's lives. Such limited water resources have forced Australia's population to concentrate around areas with access to surface water, particularly in the southeast where the Murray-Darling flows. The three largest cities, Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide, are all located near the system or have indirect connections. Areas beyond the reach of the river or without effective water storage are virtually uninhabitable. It is important to note that only about 6% of Australia's land area is suitable for agriculture, and much of this also relies on the Murray-Darling for water. However, given the size of the country, even this 6% would give Australia a larger area of arable land than the combined agricultural areas of many Southeast Asian countries, including Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. This helps maintain domestic food supplies and exports, but also means that the rest of the country remains uninhabitable due to water shortages. More serious is the growing conflict between states and vested interests over water resources. Farmers need water to grow cotton and wheat. Governments need water for food security. Communities need water for drinking. And environmental groups are calling for the protection of natural flows for the ecosystem. In recent years, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan has been proposed to redistribute water more equitably, but it has been controversial and has not fully addressed the huge demand for limited supplies. One of the key reasons why Australia's population remains lower than many other developed countries is historical. The process of immigration to Australia started very late. Compared to other immigration countries such as the United States or Canada, Australia started centuries later and faced specific geographical and political barriers that made the population expansion process slow, unable to keep up with the potential of the land area that this country possesses. In fact, the indigenous people, the Aboriginal Australians, have lived on this continent for more than 50,000 years. However, they were hunter-gatherers, sparsely distributed, and did not build urban civilizations. So, when we talk about modern migration history, we're talking about the first European arrivals, and that didn't happen until 1770, when Captain James Cook of the Royal Navy first surveyed and claimed Australia's easternmost land called New South Wales for Britain. It wasn't until 1788, nearly 2 decades later, that the first real immigration began. Not of people seeking freedom or opportunity, but of convicts. Britain, facing overcrowding in its prisons, chose Australia as a land of exile to send its condemned convicts to live. The First Fleet, called the First Fleet, consisted of 11 ships and about 500 people, including 730 convicts who landed at Port Jackson, now the city of Sydney. Compared to the United States, the difference is clear. By 1790, just 2 years after Australia began to be settled by Europeans, the United States had more than 4 million people, while Australia had only about 250,000 to 500,000 indigenous people and a small number of Europeans, mostly convicts and accompanying soldiers. Australia's population grew slowly throughout the 19th century, mainly from England, Ireland, and Scotland, but never at the explosive pace of the Americas. Part of the reason was its geographical isolation. Australia was tens of thousands of miles from Europe. The United States, on the other hand, bordered the Atlantic Ocean and could receive European settlers in just a few weeks by boat. Getting to Australia, by contrast, took months, was expensive and risky. In addition, at a time when major migrations were taking place around the world, Australia was still a harsh, little-known land with little of the allure of the Promised Land in the United States. It was not until the 1850s, when the gold rush broke out in Victoria, that Australia saw its first major wave of immigration from around the world, especially from China, Germany, Italy, and Greece. However, the number of immigrants was still not as large as in the Americas, partly due to strict immigration control policies and increasing ethnic conflicts. In particular, after the gold rush, the Australian government implemented policies that restricted people of color, culminating in the White Australia policy of 1901, which prevented Chinese Indians and other Asians from migrating to Australia. After a late start in the history of migration, Australia continued to be held back by its own policies. For nearly a century, the country implemented one of the most blatantly racist policies in the modern world, the White Australia policy, officially introduced in 1901. The policy aimed to keep Australia's population purely white, mainly from Britain or Northern Europe, while minimizing immigration from Asians, Africans, and other non-European ethnic groups. At the time, the wave of immigration from China, especially during the gold rush, caused concern among the British population. Politicians used the argument that people of color would dilute the Anglo-Saxon identity of Australia, causing social insecurity and unfair competition for labor. The result was a series of laws that tightly controlled immigration, such as requiring language tests in European languages, an indirect way of excluding non-English speakers. While the United States and Canada were opening their doors to millions of immigrants each year, Australia chose to close its doors and turn its back on much of the world. This policy prevented Australia from taking advantage of the global migration wave for nearly 50 years, and as a result, the country's population growth rate seriously lagged behind its economic and resource potential. While the United States reached 150 million people in the mid-20th century, Australia only reached 7 million in 1945. Severe labor shortages, especially after World War II, forced the Australian government to face a life-and-death choice: either open up or lose national influence. The turning point came after 1945 when World War II ended and Japan gradually emerged as a new power in Asia. Australia, with its small population and isolated geographical location, began to realize that the nation's survival could not depend on the British alone, and that expanding its population was imperative to ensure security, economic development, and assert its position on the international stage. The government began to relax its immigration policy, initially still prioritizing Europeans, such as Germany, Italy, Greece, then expanding to Eastern European countries, such as Hungary, Czechoslovakia, places where political refugees after major upheavals, such as the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 or the Prague Spring of 1968. However, the most powerful change really came from the 1970s when Australia officially abolished the White Australia policy and began to build an immigration policy based on ability, labor demand, and humanity. Also, during this period, the wave of Southeast Asian refugees, especially the Vietnamese boat people, after 1975 created a major milestone in diversifying the Australian population. Thousands of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Lao families were accepted, settled, and became an inseparable part of the modern Australian social structure. Since the 1990s, Australia has continued to receive refugee groups from the Middle East, Africa, and South America. People fleeing war, conflict, and oppression from countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, El Salvador, etc., were granted humanitarian visas and given conditions to integrate. Although there is still controversy over immigration policy, it is clear that Australia has completely shifted from a conservative country to a controlled multicultural model. To date, according to statistics from the Australian Bureau of Statistics (ABS), nearly 30% of the Australian population was born overseas, coming from more than 190 different countries. Italian, Greek, Vietnamese, Chinese, Indian, Lebanese, and more recently Filipino and Korean communities all have become part of Australia's modern identity. The government has also recognized that skilled migration is one of the pillars to sustain economic growth, cope with an aging population, and replenish a high-quality workforce. However, Australia currently maintains a cap of around 200,000 immigrants per year, with a portion set aside for humanitarian purposes. Not everyone is accepted, and many are rejected despite their efforts to integrate. In addition, issues such as racism, cultural gaps, and illegal immigration debates remain hot topics, showing that the process of becoming a multicultural nation is not simple and will take time to complete. Australia has vast natural resource reserves: coal gas, iron ore, gold, uranium, all at world-class levels. But paradoxically, these advantages are becoming a burden as the world moves towards clean energy and the climate crisis escalates. In 2020, historic bushfires burned more than 18 million hectares, killing millions of wildlife, including thousands of koalas, the national symbol. And this is not an isolated event. Prolonged heat, erratic rainfall, persistent drought, and degraded ecosystems are making already limited habitats even more fragile. In addition to natural disasters, Australia's geographical location has also pushed the country into an increasingly tense geopolitical confrontation. Located close to the Asia-Pacific region and a longtime ally of the United States, Australia is caught in a tug-of-war between Washington and Beijing. Trade ties with China used to be strong, but tensions have escalated in recent years, causing Australia to lose much of its agricultural, coal, and mineral exports. Australia, needing to protect its sovereignty while also maintaining growth, has been forced to walk a tightrope between the two poles of global power, a difficult task in an increasingly polarized world. What do you think about the future of Australia? What is the solution for a dry but potential country like Australia to develop sustainably? Leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel to discover more interesting stories about the world.